I started telling him that I think I understand these feelings. However, if you give in to that temptation even once, it won't be easy to go back to your old life afterward. I took his knife and stabbed him in the leg so he couldn't run away. I started to tell him that I was still hoping to get home before it got too dark. As soon as that girl ran away, I started telling him that if he would turn himself in before midnight if he wanted to live. I ordered my shadow soldier to follow him. If he didn't voluntarily surrender by midnight, he would be killed. I started to leave with the words that I hope he survives. I don't know how much patience this orc will have. I was leaving and realized that finally tomorrow would be the beginning of paradise on the island. The next day, the helicopter with the hunters headed towards the island. Hunter Ruji sat on his chair and watched his phone, but he couldn't hold back the trembling in his hands. For at that moment, he felt the aura of death that was approaching him. When he fought Jin Woo, he took his hand to his face and began to tell himself that he had become too sensitive. There were 2 destroyers and 4 frigates sailing behind them on the coast of China and on the coast of Taiwan, near Chinju Island. In addition, there were 12 frigates with hunters stationed in the north of the island. One of them, even if you let them weaken for even a second, would attract the attention of the ants, who would immediately attack them. The other hunter started to ask his mentor if he thought it would work against them. But he replied that if they didn't try it, they wouldn't know. The Knights Guild was here for that very purpose, for their defense team must take care of any creatures that might get to the mainland by flying past them. Elsewhere, one of the hunters started saying that he would leave the rear on the other guys since they are all from the guild and are staying here. The deputy guild master could take care of the combat training, but he didn't understand how to envision it. After all, he is only a guild deputy master in words. But the hunter began to tell him that their successes had only increased because of him and his knowledge, as well as the expansion of their scope of work, all of which were his merits. However, he felt very fake sending his head to the front lines and asked him to return unharmed. At the same time, some hunters started yelling over the phone how they could send their star who had recently joined them. After all, if anything happened to her, the guild would not be happy with them. While hunters from each guild were distributed throughout the south at the request of the Hunter Association, if Right is successful, no one wants the surviving ants to infiltrate the mainland. The head of the association with a hunter in rank A, 10 hunters in rank D and below protect the state's territory. Hunters who have retired and awakened hunters who have decided not to be hunters have also stood up to defend. Their number is about 5,000, which corresponds to 1/10 of all awakened hunters in the country. There were other hunters flying in one of the helicopters, and the guy who was a cameraman from the official press started saying that his title entailed broadcasting the hunters professionally, and this raid would be broadcast live across the country. They don't have to worry about possible mistakes because the broadcast is on a 10-minute delay, and at that time the editing team cuts everything out. But some hunters didn't understand why a cameraman was accompanying them in such a dangerous place, and what the president was thinking. However, another hunter who was sitting next to him started to say that their direct duty as hunters is to protect the people. However, they need to realize that they need to be extremely careful. But the videographer began to say that even if they perceive him as a weakling, he is actually a hunter with experience and qualifications like the rest of the hunters. There are many awakened who have chosen a life without such endless raids, and videographers with hunter qualifications are an example of how the 2 jobs can be combined. This isn't the first time for him. He has participated in dungeon sweeps several times. However, he doesn't know if his experience will help him this time, because he was scared. But another hunter started telling him not to worry so much, because the Hunters Association approved this broadcast. So, there is hope that the 4th raiding will end successfully and this will be the first and last time the public will see the S-Class raid. Besides, they've already failed 3 times on the island, and they've decided that this time they will, because if the speech ends in failure, they will most likely disappear from the face of the earth. It was time for the world to need a hero, but one of the hunters turned his attention to another and asked him what he was doing here, for he didn't expect him to join as well. It was an S-rank healer, but he started to say that without his healer gift, Han would die in the first one, because he is the one who gets hit in the head first. But Han started to get angry and yelled at him, asking why he would be the one to get hit in the head first. But suddenly their conversation was interrupted by Hunter Cha and asked the guildmaster for the video of Ali and Hunter Jin Woo. But he replied that no, he hadn't seen it. But at that moment, another hunter started saying that the show was already starting, because they were flying up to the island, and the healer's hands immediately started shaking, because he was scared. At this time, the hunters were already on the island, with Ruji at the head. They were walking through the streets of a neighborhood, but they didn't look around and realized that this city now looked like a ghost. On the ground were the remains of ants that seemed to be eating each other. Ruji realized that there was a predator among them. Ruji started to contact Bravo's squad and asked them to respond in order. All the other groups were ready and they decided to start this raid. Suddenly explosions rang out all over the island. The hunters who were on the helicopters nearby started looking out the window at this power that was coming from the island. At that moment they realized that the Japanese had already started their operation, and all the ants flew out of their hiding place. The first thing they did was to chase the helicopter flying next to them. However, a hunter named Absolute Weapon came out of the helicopter and said that he would now take care of his pursuers. He began to use his fire skills and his fire arrows flew straight ahead, destroying the ants that were chasing their helicopter. Another hunter watching all this was impressed by all this power. However, that hunter said that it didn't impress him yet because he thought that such power wasn't enough to really hurt them. Of the 3 ants that flew after them, only 1 was hurt, and the rest continued their pursuit. He ordered the man who was driving that helicopter to hold the helicopter firmly steady, for it might shake slightly from his attack. He started to use another skill, which made the fire fly straight at the ants, and they all instantly burned. These ants had evolved a lot, and they used to be hunters that he had just destroyed. They seemed to be resistant to his magic, similar to the monsters from the ranked dungeon where he had to focus on his firepower. And at that moment, he jumped out of the helicopter and decided to find out their skills. The hunters watching him saw him descend to the ground. They didn't know if he was going to be okay, but the girl sneered and was sure that nothing would happen, as his fire magic was aimed at fighting several enemies. And as soon as he landed, he started burning all the living things that were near him. All the ants started to burn and disappeared at the same moment. This hunter wondered, for it had been a long time since he had last played with ants. Now he could hear the same cracking sound, but it was like deafening explosions. As soon as he finished massacring the ants on the ground, he shouted to his companions who were on the helicopter and asked them to come down to him. The man who was watching all of this realized that the current plan did not include any retreat options. This meant that they would find themselves completely isolated while inside the nest. For about an hour, the Japanese hunters distracted the soldier ants, during which time they would attempt to kill the queen. And once everyone was ready, they decided to make things happen quickly, because it was them, and so there shouldn't be any problems. They all started to descend to the ground to begin their journey to the queen's nest and destroy her. Even on the second aircraft carrier, the guys who were on board started the operation and activated the jamming generator. Once the jamming generator was activated, the signals from the queen and the hunters who were cutting down the ants stopped reaching the island. Some of the ants were able to adapt, while others were unable to recover. One of the huntresses was chopping the ants with her large daggers and started telling her comrade to hurry up and adapt or they would die. Team Bravo started saying that at this rate they would kill all the ants before the Korean team killed the queen. Another hunter asked where their comrade Kong was, but he was in the meantime playing catch-up with the ants, tearing off their wings that allowed them to fly. He was old enough, but he was still acting like a child. Suddenly, the Delta team saw an explosion on one of the volcanoes, and a guy named John was there. He used his ice control ability to freeze all the ants that were there. So he wondered what would happen if they started fighting his ice and flames. After powerful explosions, the squad descended straight to the queen's lair, which was inside the volcano. Their goal was to destroy the queen. Once they were inside, they realized that the place used to be a fiery prison that held enemies. But now it only worked with ants, and the lower-ranked hunters decided to figure out how to get the queen. There were many passageways around them that looked like mazes. One of the hunters, whose name was Absolute Weapon, started using his skill and decided to try and find the entrance. He launched his fireballs into those very passageways, and suddenly the sound of explosions came from all the passageways. He realized that all these paths were all tangled like a maze, and if they went randomly, they would come back as his fireball. He began to assume that the deep place where no explosions could be heard was in the nearest passage he saw. The hunter from the White Tiger Guild hesitated, for what was expected of a hunter had happened. John in his presence was already reassuring, and while they were looking for an entrance, I completed my daily task. After that, I ran 10 kilometers. And as soon as I stopped, I realized that the area where I lived hadn't been this crowded before. But today there was no one here at all, and that was probably because the broadcast of the raid had started. The rank hunters from Korea and Japan undoubtedly have a lot of power. I realized that there was no point in watching them now unless something unforeseen happened. Meanwhile, inside the volcano, a hunter with a bow was destroying the approaching ants. The hunter John started to say that barring some individuals, everything was as expected. But the other hunter saw such ants for the first time, and they were the queen's guards. If so, they are not weak, because they have poor eyesight, and they are only able to protect the inside of the nest. If so, there would be no difficulty, and their firepower is more than enough to destroy them. But the healer realized that the queen was indeed here, and he speculated that she might abandon her people and escape to another hunter began to say that from this island these things have nowhere to run. The video reporter at this time realized that it was very dark and he couldn't get a good shot of everything, but he was confident that his headquarters would tweak things if needed. They continued on their way and passed through a large cave. At one point they noticed that in front of them was a clutch with a very large number of eggs. If the clutch was here, the queen must have been nearby. I didn't realize that these ants were guards after all. One of the hunters decided to burn the whole thing, but Hunter Cha noticed that there was one huge one among the eggs that had hatched. They couldn't believe their eyes that it was also an ant egg. What else could hatch from such a big egg? Their main objective now was to destroy the queen, and everything else was unimportant. They understood the danger, but the current situation was beyond expectations. The monster that hatched from the egg with me is most likely still here somewhere. At the same time, outside, the hunters were fighting the ants that attacked from outside. One of the hunters turned her attention to her comrade and told him he didn't look well. He stood there covered in the blue liquid that was also with the ants, and there was nothing he could do about it. The guys were more annoying than he thought and came at him with great force and coherence. He thought he could handle them in one fell swoop, but ended up getting hit in the shoulder and under the rib. The healer who was supposed to heal him started saying she wanted something in return. It's really true that she really wants something in return, and this time it wasn't money. The other hunter who was injured started asking her what she wants then, since she earns more than him anyway. Even though she's still a child, she's so greedy for money. But suddenly they noticed that a swarm of ants was flying at them again. And just as one of the hunters turned around to ask what she wanted, he saw someone finish off the healer with one powerful blow. He couldn't understand what had happened. But at the same moment some monster appeared and started running straight at him. That hunter wanted to avenge his partner, but that monster also did it to him in one blow. It destroyed him and he fell to the ground. The third hunter started screaming and waving his big sword, but eventually he too was destroyed. They all lay on the ground, still not knowing what had killed them. A hunter with a large shield stood in front of the ant, and as he looked at it, he realized that this was the royal guard. Each of these creatures is comparable in strength to a ranked hunter. However, this animal does not only live in Africa, but unlike humans, who cannot predict their movements are much easier to understand. At the same moment, Hunter Cha stuck her sword into the ant's back. By doing so, she stepped on it with her feet, and the entire sword began to slash the large ant. However, as soon as she stepped on the ground, another ant was behind her back. She reacted in time, turned around, and began slicing it to pieces. Although she was able to destroy it, she realized that they were damn tough guys, even tougher than she could have imagined. The Queen's guardsmen are different from normal ants, and yet, it's even good that there aren't many of them here at all. One of the hunters who was standing behind started telling the others not to worry. That way, if anything, he would have their backs. The head of the white tiger turned his attention to him and realized that he was completely daring today. But that guy started telling him to watch himself and not to make any mistakes of the new recruits. And as soon as he finished off another ant, he realized and started telling the others that just chopping the skull was not enough. After all, these critters would live for a few more minutes, so they needed to be cut and their limbs slashed so they couldn't move and ponder the fact that the queen wasn't at rest just yet. And from the looks of it, they are of the previous generation. The first generation doesn't seem to be part of the guard. There might be a whole bunch of hunter ants belonging to the second generation ahead of them, in which case they need to prepare carefully. None of the hunters who belonged to the mage class started making spells with their book. By doing so, he had cast reinforcements on all of his hunter friends and the energy he had given them. It was literally rushing through their bodies. This spell was a support for physical enhancement. Some of the hunters felt like they were about to rip through whole ants moving straight through. Eventually the healer stood behind and started saying that he was so invulnerable. So he would stand behind and if anything, he would take on a couple ants if there weren't enough for everyone. But the head of the white tiger started saying that no one in their right mind would rely on a healer, and regular support would suffice. So he should stand behind and just watch them. Outside, however, the atmosphere had boiled off and some of the hunters were moving towards Charlie's team, for she hadn't made contact in a while and they had to find out what had happened to them and what they were doing there. Suddenly they saw the same place where Charlie's group had last been. They stopped and noticed the footprints, realizing that it looked like they had cleared that part of the island. However, they still didn't realize where they had gone. Suddenly, one of the hunters saw glasses that belonged to the hunter himself. As soon as they looked in the distance, they saw their comrades who were lying on the ground. They couldn't believe their eyes. What could have happened to them? They were so destroyed. The masked hunter couldn't help himself, for what he saw was beyond normal. He dropped his mask on the ground and bent over. His partner didn't realize what was happening to him, but some kind of disgusting stench was permeating his nose. It was a very creepy odor, and he had never smelled anything so foul in his life. He couldn't help himself. So, he started to use his power towards that stench, and that whole part of the forest that was enveloped by that smell started to turn chilling from his power. In the queen ant's lair, the hunters fiddled with those ants for too long. But they were wrong. One of the hunters said it was actually the other way around. Long is when you spend more than 5 minutes to kill an enemy. But with the help of this spell, it was as if they now had wings behind their backs, and the hunter had killed twice as many monsters as the head of the white tiger in such a short time. It would take about 15 minutes to reach the royal chambers, and it wouldn't take them long at all to get out through the tunnels they had already passed through. But altogether it would take about 30 minutes. Now the most important thing was the destruction of the queen. At this very moment, the huntress joked about the scent and the queen was most likely ahead of them. The head of the white tiger decided to find out and started relying on his senses. He realized that there was a queen in the distance along with her soldiers. She was at the back of the cave and there were about 8 guards around her. But if she is the huntress, can take them on, then the rest of us have no choice but to destroy the queen. One of the hunters asked the huntress would she be able to handle the guards while he fought the queen, and she was agreeable to such action. One of the hunters began to do his fire spell, and he had held back before. But today he decided that it would be a waste if he didn't go all out, and a huge fire dragon spell began to move towards the queen. But at that moment, one of the ants got behind this hunter, but he was lucky to be blocked by the others behind him. The hunter with the bow began to tell him not to worry, for he would provide them with the head of the white tiger. At this time, he decided that he would also not self-limit himself. And to hell with all these restrictions, even if he had to turn into that ugly monster. He would exterminate those damn insects. Hunter Cha was surprised, for this was the first time she had seen this beastly appearance. Suddenly, one of the hunters shouted for her to spring into action. She took that as a signal and activated her skill, Provoking Wave. All the ants in the area turned their attention to her. Once the other hunters realized that it worked, they immediately started heading towards the ant queen. The hunter realized that with the weather all the guards would leave their positions, so he would do his best to hold the queen. And now this hunter had decided that the opponent for the queen would first and foremost be himself, standing in front of her with his large shield and spear. The hunter, who was apart from the association and filming everything that was happening in this cave, could not believe his eyes. After all, he thought it was a dream and just now the number of onlookers had increased by 80%. And he realized that he had to get closer, because the spectators should see everything with their own eyes. But just as he started walking forward, someone grabbed him by the back and ordered him to stop. They are now in Boss S's territory, and so they can't vouch for his safety. So it's best to keep a low profile. And now the game is over. Now it's a serious fight. That hunter with the camera on his head couldn't understand. After all, had that hunter lied when he said that his combat skill level was comparable to Airang? He began to think that it wasn't. After all, he and his Airang weren't even a match for him. At the same time, in one of the apartments in a town near the island, Grandma turned to her husband and said that hunters would be on TV today, and asked if he would watch it with her. But he replied that he was not interested. However, his grandmother continued talking, interrupting him, for they had just said that today all the enemies would be defeated. But he replied, after all, they always say that. It's nothing new, though. Grandmother filled with hope, for these hunters were the only ones who could avenge their child, and they were bound to watch, even if the whole world collapsed. But Grandpa didn't dare to get up, and Grandma went into the other room and sat down in front of the TV and thought about how stubborn he was, like a sheep. The TV started saying that the South Korean hunters had just bravely engaged the queen in battle and were right now in her chambers, and the very ant that everyone was so eager to see appeared before their eyes. The queen and the hunter Ma Dong are holding up just fine. However, the rest of the hunters need to hurry to help them. And just now, Hunter Beck eliminated one of the queen's guards. Grandma was very scared and felt as if the whole world had gone crazy. Other people were also watching on TV. There were only 4 ants left to guard the queen, and they had already wiped out half of the royal guard. Soon there were only 3 ants left protecting her, and then only 2. The hunters decided to destroy them and make their way to the queen. By the end of the raid, there were none left, and everyone heard on TV that all the guards had been exterminated. Suddenly, Grandpa walked in and, slime in his eyes, said that this was the 4th round and they must win, for there was only one enemy left on the horizon, the queen. By destroying her, they could finish off the ants in the studio. At this time, the man started calling his director and telling him that they had just increased their audience reach by 85%, breaking the previous record. The US, China, France, Ukraine and Korea will soon join the list of countries mopping up the rank S-gate. The hunters skillfully restrained the queen, and the attacks came right at her. The other hunters stood behind her and delivered long-range blows to her large head. I continued to close in on the target, at which point the beast-like hunter began to maul her with his sharp claws, realizing that without her guard she was nothing more than a defenseless insect. But suddenly the queen began to use her venom, which began to flow out of her large muzzle and towards the hunter in front of her. And as soon as I reached the hunters, they began to agonize in pain. But Mok, the healer who stood behind them, began to use his skills and thus restored their health. He realized that if she wanted them not to die, she better aim for him. The queen seemed to hear his words and started to move towards him, but the tank hunter who was holding her back became in front of her. He was standing right next to her huge tentacles, but he realized he couldn't let her get any closer to the healer who was standing behind her. Suddenly one of the hunters shouted for everyone to quickly move away from the queen, and he began to use his fire ring skill. The queen began to burn from all sides. And at that moment, the other hunters realized that the queen was finished. The queen of the metal wagon, and it seemed that the outcome of the battle was predetermined. However, something began to happen. For the queen was screaming in pain, and this scream began to go beyond her cave. The hunters realized it was a death howl. The other hunters, however, guessed that she was calling for someone. The hunters who were outside realized that the ants had started to return to the nest and the frequency jammer was no longer affecting them. They didn't understand what was going on here. Huntress Cha decided to end this battle and chopped off the head of the large ant queen. Eventually, this battle was finished. Some of the hunters realized that they had become the 7th team in the world that was able to sweep the S-rank dungeon. However, all of a sudden, the beast-like hunter began to sense something, and it was just reported that the ants had started to return. The hunters made the decision that they needed to get out of here as quickly as possible. However, some of the hunters said that they still had time, as the Japanese could not defeat them so easily in just an hour. Other hunters knew nothing about this, and right now the association is trying to find out the situation. One of the hunters realized that his fire barrier had been broken, and suddenly all the hunters in that cave began to feel fear running through their entire body. And suddenly they saw some ant begin to come out of the darkness and approach right towards them. This ant stood nearby and started howling very loudly. His screams spread all over the island. The beast hunter could not believe his eyes, for he saw that this power was coming from him alone. Hunter Cha couldn't breathe normally. It was like she was suffocating from the odor that came from that monster. She fell to the ground and started to cover her nose, but she was under a lot of pressure. Such monstrous power was in him, for he was just an incredible individual. And she realized that that monster was far from an ordinary individual. He appeared so suddenly, each step echoing loudly in her head. Some of the hunters wanted to destroy it, because there was no way to hesitate now, but this monster walked past them and approached the head of the ant queen that was lying on the ground. He just passed by all the hunters, and as he approached the head, he looked at it. The hunters watched in horror as that monster began to build up strength at the sight of their dead ant queen, and his terror spread throughout the cave. This meant that he was about to act, for he was very angry with the hunters who had done this. The hunters, in turn, began to fall to the ground. That ant was a terrifying force, his gaze was very frightening. And in an instant, he moved from his spot as if he had teleported, and found himself behind the back of Hunter Cha, who couldn't even imagine him moving so fast. He kicked her in the side, causing her to fly off to the side and crash into the nearest wall, with the impact creating a hole. The force of the blow was so powerful that she began to feel a terrifying pain coursing through her entire body. As soon as the other hunter shouted her name, that ant was instantly at his side and with a single blow, pierced a hole in his large shield he was holding in his hand. But the blow not only broke the shield, it completely destroyed it, and the wave of impact traveled to his arm, which broke. At the same moment, with his other hand, the ant wanted to damage him with his spear, but he was so fast and strong that he severed both of his arms at the same time. Then the ant slowly moved away from him, and the hunter, standing behind him, began to bleed. The beast-like hunter, as soon as he saw all this, turned around and wanted to finish off such an ant. However, the ant was too fast and dealt heavy damage to him in an instant. The next hunter, who possessed strong flame magic, was also hurt by the ant. It slashed him from head to toe, and now he couldn't move from his spot. Another hunter who had a large bow started shooting at it and thought that the ant wouldn't be able to dodge. However, the ant turned around and began to take his attacks. That arrow that flew towards him couldn't do anything to him, for he simply caught it and broke it. The skills of such an ant were great, for he simply stopped every attack that was made towards him. And as soon as he broke that arrow, he approached the best and hit him with all his might, and he flew aside. Suddenly, the tank was hit by an ant who had recently had his arms cut off. However, he started to say that he let it decide how much he could fit in, and as long as the healer was with them, it was just a trifle. Using his healing properties, he began to repair the wounds that had been inflicted by the horrible monster ant. The healers behind him applied their self-defense skills, using camouflage to hide and completely suppress their presence. However, this skill had a single drawback: one could not move while using it. Nevertheless, it is perfectly acceptable for a healer, so if he wants to get rid of it, he needs to find a healer first, and the ant cannot break them as long as he can heal his team. But as it turned out, that wasn't a problem for Ant. He grabbed the tank by the leg and started beating it against the ground in different directions. Eventually, the tank was thrown aside, and it couldn't move. The healer who was watching all this could not understand what had happened. After all, the ant was paying attention to him at the same moment, and he realized that his camouflage skill was still active. However, he wondered, did that ant really notice me after all? Suddenly, something happened, for the beast-like hunter began to shout to them, "I am a hunter healer." But the hunter healer himself could not understand how this was possible, for he was, roughly speaking, invisible. However, an ant was at his back and made a hole in his chest with his big hand. As a result, all the spells began to dispel from the beast-like hunter, bleeding out. Was stunned that his comrade had been killed. This terrifying monster stood behind the slain healer. The last thing the healer could say was, "Run away, Hung, for you won't be able to handle such a terrifying force." But the beast-like hunter couldn't believe his eyes. The hunters who watched this horror could not say a word. In the end, the healer was killed, but the saber-like hunter couldn't just sit there and watch as his comrade was slaughtered. He lunged at the ant, but the ant stopped him with one hand and lifted him into the air by his neck. And so this ant began to say that he was running away from something that all the hunters could not believe that he was talking. For they realized it was a bastard, it had consumed him and, along with his life, taken all his strength and memories. This ant started saying they were weak and killed the queen and even put down the soldiers, but they miscalculated. He started to ask who their king was, but Hunter Han didn't understand what he meant. All the hunters who were in that cave were badly wounded and lay on the ground without moving. And suddenly this terrifying ant monster started turning his head the other way and started saying that there was a very strong guy outside. And a moment later he started moving towards him. And as soon as he flew away, the hunter who was being held by the neck was on the ground, and he started to realize that there was a Ruji hunter outside, and he flew straight towards him, but it didn't matter now. He had to get out of here before he came back. But as soon as the hunter started to rise, he saw that a huge number of ants were moving straight towards them, and outside there were several hunters running through the forest, and for them there were. It was strange that first Charlie and now Delta, and with their team too, lost communication. Ruji began to realize that radio frequency interference. There's no way to damage them. They're not that far away. He started contacting Bravo Team, and Bravo Team started contacting him. He started asking if they could contact Charlie and Delta Team, and the girl said that there is a connection only with the Alpha girl from the Bravo Team started to say that they can go on a reconnaissance. But Ryuk replied that there is no need because he is on his way and they need to deal with everything at once and they have to go to the place of the meeting, and suddenly he received a call. It was Gato, who was the head of the Matsumoto Association. And at that time on the waterfront of China they started saying that it looked like South Korea was in turmoil, and although the ants at least couldn't fly to China, they thought that Japan was only helping them because Yoryuji wanted to get the title of national level hunter. And it is possible that all national level hunters have cleared the dungeon of such a high rank, and Yoryuji, despite his many feats of such a record, is not. But suddenly, one of the men began to guess that this performance is just a diversion. Eyes, because Yoryuji is still too weak, and the captain of the ship began to say that he thought his colleague would understand if he were lucky enough to meet him, and however one of the countries involved in this rig would suffer a crushing failure. And as soon as Ryuji reached the place where his part of the team was, he saw that his comrades had been killed, and the other man he was talking to on the comms started asking if he had any casualties, and Ryuji replied that yes, more died than they thought, but that's why they sent the third rankers. To avoid too many casualties, and they're just weaklings and don't need to pay attention to them. It was too ruthless, according to Ryuji, but the man on the comms started to say that for now, he's alive, it doesn't matter, even if 100 of them die, because the chicken team is now trying to destroy the queen, and since the frequency jammers are no longer working, all the monsters are now heading back to the nest. And Ryuji started to say that he's worried because it wasn't part of their original plan, but he doesn't think that this kind of thing can stop them. And the man who was talking to him and started to ask him what the odds are that the Korean hunters will survive, and Ryuji started to answer that based on their fighting together on the training ground and the composition and fighting ability of the current members of the raid, they don't stand a chance for that man. This was great news because despite the fact that Japan provided all outside help in clearing the dungeon, all the raid participants had to retreat as the Korean team was destroyed, and Ryuji's aspirations to reach the national level unfortunately did not succeeded for him. It will be a great headline in their plan to destroy the team's ranked hunters. At the same moment, Ryuji began to tell everyone to start retreating. And as soon as the order came from above for them to start retreating, the Ryuji was attacked by that ant that had massacred the Korean hunters. The Ryuji looked at it and realized that it was an unusual ant and immediately ordered his comrades to leave the area because they would be in the way if there was a serious battle. And at that moment the Ryuji began to realize that this ant was emanating a rather murderous aura, but the ant asked a counter question, he or that king who was among these hunters? The Ryuji was excited that such a monster. He drew his sword and said, he's what? He is the king. And the ant started to mock, but the Ryuji didn't understand. When such a great power is coming straight at him, and he had a feeling that something like this he had already experienced, but could not remember when it was, but suddenly his sword was broken and the ant took him down with a single blow. At the same time, inside the cave, some of the hunters who were not seriously wounded began to resist the onslaught of ants that flew straight at them. On others were seriously wounded, and even despite all their efforts, their condition left much to be desired, and now their only hope for salvation is the skill of a hunter who, using his powerful fire, but it was still not enough. And they realized it was the end, but suddenly a shadow began to appear at their feet, holding back those ants. It was a shadow soldier. The beast-like hunter couldn't understand where the black soldier was coming from, and at that very moment, I was standing in the city and I realized that now was the time to come to their aid, and I blotted out the word exchange with which I could teleport to the part where my shadow soldier was. The videographer, who was filming everything that was happening, was looking at the huge ants that were flying around him. He began to remember that during the last conversation with his father he had said something wrong, and if he had only known that things would turn out this way, he would not have been so stingy with his words. He was already ready to die, but suddenly those ants that had gotten close to him suddenly became the targets of a huge sword that slashed through them. At the same time, the guys who were in charge of the broadcasts, all of them were horrified by what they saw. Some ant had managed to kill all the high-level Korean hunters. They didn't understand how this could even happen. But suddenly, Chief's girlfriend started screaming that their lines were about to break, and there were many calls from viewers. The chief told her there was nothing they could do. After all, they can't broadcast a bloody meat grinder to the world. The chief was already despairing that they had lost, but suddenly one of the guys started saying that someone unknown had just appeared on the scene. When they looked at the screen, Chief couldn't believe his eyes and started telling them to resume the broadcast as soon as possible. One of the guys said that it would already be live and they wouldn't have time to announce prices in case of an emergency. But Chief didn't care about that, because they had already stopped the broadcasts and it was unlikely to be worse than it is now. And they have no choice but to turn on the broadcast right now, because now the fate of the entire humanity depends on one person. Inside the cave, Jin Woo appeared with his commanders-in-chief, who were shadow soldiers. Behind them stood a large army, ready to fight for him so that no one would be harmed. Now the fate of all the hunters and all of Korea depends only on one guy who somehow appeared on this island. Jin Woo asked his commander-in-chief Aaron to start using his provocative scream skill. Suddenly all the ants paid attention to him. It was a good job, and Jin Woo thanked Aaron for such a great skill. He then took out his big blades and began to deal with the armored ants, for they had no place to run anymore. A huge shadow orc stood and covered the badly wounded hunters, but the hunters in turn looked ahead and did not realize what was going on here and who was fighting for them now. But the main thing was that their partner did not worry, because from now on everything would be fine. After all, a very strong hunter is fighting now, and his wards are as strong as we are, but they have one peculiarity: they are immortal. The battle only lasted a few minutes, but Jin Woo realized that he needed to speed up. Thus, he began to resurrect all the dead ants and thus replenish his army. The videographer couldn't understand what was happening, because all the ants that were dead and started fighting against their own videographers started talking over the comms and asking why he was frozen like a statue. After all, he had to do something, and fast. But the videographer didn't understand what was going on, because he saw the ants start devouring each other for some reason. And at that moment, Jin Woo approached the badly wounded hunters and pulled out his potion that healed wounds. He realized that this was no time for bargaining, and began telling the hunters to hurry up and drink what he was giving them. And as soon as the bottles were finished and empty, the hunters began to rise. After all, their wounds had all healed, but for some reason, Hunter Chai did not regain consciousness. After all, her wounds were serious, and Jin Woo's skills were not enough to heal her at the moment. She was barely breathing. And just as Jin Woo started to say that it was time to get out of here before the others came, they wanted to do so, but suddenly that ant who was the strongest of all appeared. He went inside the cave and started saying that there was no king outside and it was just a fake. Then he turned his eyes in our direction and began to say that there was a man among us who called himself a king. The other hunters realized as soon as they saw him that he had returned, and were surprised by it. After all, they realized that Ruji was turning out to be completely independent of him. At this time, Jin Woo stood up and started talking to the hunter who was near him to take care of Hunter Cha. He stood up and started walking, pondering why the connection with Ruji's shadow had broken off. And here was the answer: it was because that ant had finished him off. When Jin Woo approached him, the ant started to ask him if he was a human king. But Jin Woo was a little surprised that he was speaking his language, and it was amazing to hear the insect talking. They met gazes, and their aura began to rise up towards the cave. The ant stared intently at Jin Woo and realized that a dangerous aura of baldness was emanating from him. It began to emit a terrifying sound with full force, which caused Jin Woo's clothes to shiver. But at the same moment, Jin Woo realized that after that scream, he looked more like an insect than someone capable of speaking his language, and began to resemble a human more. The hunters who were in town 5 minutes before were watching the broadcast on their phones, and it said that the broadcast was being prepared and technical work was being done. By improving the quality of the signal, they apologize because of the cause of the inconvenience. The hunters didn't understand what was going on there and where that horrible ant was coming from. Other hunters started to get nervous because they couldn't understand why they had ended the broadcasts. At such a moment, the television began to broadcast breaking news from the scene, and during the broadcast it was reported that the hunter Ben-gu had died, and it was not yet known what had happened to the other hunters who were also in the cave. Some hunters who were watching the broadcast initially guessed that an unknown hunter had just appeared in the Queen's chambers, and right now the broadcast would be resumed. And what they saw shocked them. They saw an ant start talking and asking about some king. But when the broadcast disappeared, all they heard was that the connection was immediately cut off. After all, the ant was speaking in the human language. Furthermore, he had even killed Ruji. He was incredibly strong. One of the hunters was watching the motion sensors, but the chairman started asking him where the creature that killed the hunters was now. It was the president of the Japanese Hunters Association. His ward started to tell him that he had just returned to the Queen's chambers, but the chairman couldn't believe what he was about to say, that the Korean hunters had survived. He replied, "It seems that way. In addition, an unknown source of immense magical power has appeared there, one that surpasses even the power of an ant. From the looks of it, someone else has arrived." The chairman began to speak so that they would turn on the broadcast as soon as possible. At this time, Jin Woo's sister started to ask her mom what she was doing there, but she apologized and said that if she wasn't bothering her studying, she wanted to turn on the TV, because they were showing the broadcast. But it suddenly turned off. The sister started asking her mother where her brother had gone, and she said that he had left in a hurry and said he would be back soon. The mother couldn't understand why young people always rush to go somewhere, but at that time, the sister was watching the broadcast on her phone. At the same time, the president of the Korean Association shuddered from his seat as soon as he heard that a young man named Jin Woo had appeared on that island. The president was so excited that his assistant asked him to calm down, for he broke the chair with his hand from excitement. All the spectators began to watch as the TV showed that a large ant swung around and tried to hit the hunter who had just appeared on the battlefield. In reality, this was exactly what happened. He hit the hunter Jin Woo's face with all his strength so hard that the ground moved from its place. And the wave of impact was so strong that all the rocks that were lying nearby started flying in different directions. The hunters who were standing behind began to cover their faces with their hands as the air was so strong that nothing could be seen. It seemed to them that Jin Woo and the ant were equal in strength. But they seemed to have underestimated the ant, as it started its attack with a direct kick. And as soon as all the dust settled and the ants fell to the ground towards me, one stood up and started saying that he too was weak and not a king. But what the hunters saw was like Jin Woo who stood up to such a powerful blow. And at this moment, he became angry, and Hunter Jin Woo spat out the blood that was left after that punch. Excited, he activated his ruler hand skill, and all of his power started to accumulate in his left hand, after which he struck back. As soon as he swung, Ant realized that he wouldn't be able to dodge, and he began to prepare for this strike. Jin Woo couldn't stop anymore. He hit the ant with full force, and the ant started flying several hundred meters backwards, crashing into the wall behind him. The sound was even more powerful than the first blow the ant had taken. The hunters behind could only watch this with their mouths open, for their surprise was written all over their faces. One of the hunters started asking the other one, "Is this guy definitely magic class?" And the one replied that he had certainly thought so, but he didn't expect him to be that strong. And at this moment, the ant started to move towards him, but Hunter Jin Woo realized that he was quite strong and probably had an exoskeleton, and this started to annoy him even more. He prepared for battle and raised his right arm to block the ant's attack. And just as he blocked it, the earth shuddered again from the backlash. Right back at that ant. This battle was so incredible that they fought at such a speed that no one could see them. In the end, Jin Woo was able to hit him right on the head, and at the same time, the sounds of the blows came to the videographer, who realized that this was an incredible battle. Compared to them, he was just an ordinary hunter who could only stand and watch from afar. He realized that he would go so crazy just from the sheer power of their magic alone. Ant realized after being hit on the head that he was losing in strength and couldn't understand who he really was and where he got such power from. The battle continued, and they fought at full strength. When they clashed blows, both of them bounced aside from such force, but it was the hunter Jin Woo who was stronger. Indeed, his punches were doing a lot of damage, and Ant realized that his exoskeleton was starting to crack. He couldn't understand why, because his body was so strong that no one could hurt him, but then this guy showed up and everything went downhill. He was taking more and more damage, but suddenly, and wounded Jin Woo. But it wasn't a serious wound, just a scratch on his face. When Jin Woo realized that he had been bitten by a fawn, he jumped back and realized that it was a poison that was penetrating his body. It was a paralyzing poison and the ability was obtained after absorbing the cone. It is one of the deadliest poisons in the world, and its effects are increased tenfold when mixed with magical energy. The ant started to say that he was in pain, despicable man, and right after saying that, the ant wanted to strike one last blow and destroy the hunter. Jin Woo lowered his head and was ready to meet his blow, but at the same time, the Japanese hunters who were the last of the surviving houses appeared in the city. One of the hunters was cowardly with fear, realizing that they wouldn't be able to defeat this monster that was very strong and not by human standards. However, the girl did not want to hear this and took him by the scruff of the neck, trying to bring him to his senses, since according to her he was starting to go crazy. But that hunter kept saying that they were no match for him, considering that that ant was very strong. She tossed him aside and started saying he was nothing. She looked at the helicopter that hovered above them and started to say that there were much bigger problems ahead of them. But at that very moment, Jin blocked the last punch that this monster ant wanted to throw, and he couldn't believe his big red eyes how he managed to do it. In response, he only received the strongest blow on his muzzle. It flew off to the side with great speed and crashed into a rock. At this moment, Hunter Jin Woo was completing her action and realized why she was so excited. With the increase in perception, the hunter became better. Jin Woo noticed that this ant was now clearly anxious, just like those guys behind Jin Woo. Looking at the hunter lying on the ground, she realized that he needed to finish him off as quickly as possible. At the same time, the ant watched Jin Woo as he jumped up the mountain and wanted to strike his foot right into its torso. But just as Jin Woo got close to him, there was an explosion from the hunter's kick, and the entire ground shook. He missed the hunters who were watching and couldn't figure out where he disappeared to, but Jin Woo noticed that the ant was hovering in the air, for it could fly. While in the air, the ant realized that even poison had no effect on this hunter, and tried to compete with him in strength. He realized that he would achieve nothing. As for him, a battle with an enemy that relies on strength for the most part is completely pointless. He realized that his advantage was speed, and if he shrunk his body, it would be easier for him to move around. The ant realized that the game was over. However, the hunter who was standing on the ground began to pull out his daggers, for he too wanted to end this battle as soon as possible. And finally the final battle began. Ant lunged towards Hunter Jin Woo with all his speed, but he suddenly noticed that he had dodged. At the same time, Jin Woo was in the air and began to strike with his blades. However, the ant repelled them. The ant threw him aside and Jin flew into a wall, but he was able to gather himself and push himself back from the surface or the walls towards the ant. They fought so fast that no one could follow them. The ant realized that he lacked speed and no one could catch up with him, for he was a hunter. Gradually, he became faster. He didn't understand how this could be, but Jin Woo realized that his rank was somewhere at the level of a demon king and perhaps even higher. However, back then, he didn't have such powerful weapons as he did now, and besides, after defeating the ram, his skills had improved markedly. He was more than certain that his exoskeleton was about to collapse, and this was his chance. Jin Woo began to deliver the final blows, causing the ant to start twisting in pain. At this moment, Jin Woo realized that he needed to act and activated his critical strike skill. He ended up landing several blows on the ant's torso, creating several holes. As soon as this happened, the notification showed that the last stage of the critical strike skill had been upgraded to a maiming skill. The ant started to run away, realizing that it wouldn't be able to deal with the hunter. But Jin Woo didn't want to just let it go, and activated his skill again, which was already stronger. As soon as Jin Woo approached the ant, he began to slash at it from all sides like a blade. After the heavy blows, the ant bounced to the side and realized that he had no way to remove this man. But suddenly he realized that he had one last trump card left up his sleeve. He started making a loud noise, attracting all the ants that were in that cave. Then he directed them all at the hunters. Jin Woo looked at him with an unwavering gaze, and the ant began to say that he should prepare to die now, for his army was coming straight for him. But Jin Woo was ready for it and started smiling. And as soon as he said his crowning word, rise up, his monstrous army of shadow soldiers started to appear behind him. They clashed in a vivid battle. All the shadow soldiers fought against the big and terrible ants, but most of the ants couldn't handle the soldiers who were stronger. Jin Woo decided to call in the heavy artillery. It was a huge orgma that appeared behind him. He turned around to him and started telling him to aim at the ants. If he hit the humans, he wouldn't call him out again. Their commander-in-chief waved his large fang, thus showing that he understood. At this time, he began to use his giant song skill, followed by the fire dragon song skill. A large fireball began to move to the side. Such a huge explosion caused a hole to form in the volcano. The hunters who were watching this couldn't believe their eyes that he had summoned such a terrifying monster. Some of the hunters realized that it didn't even smell like summoning here, and rather the devil himself deigned to Ant, who was watching all of this. He could not believe that this was happening, for he himself was the strongest and destroyed anyone who dared to go against him. He stood at the top and evolved repeatedly, for he was the king on this island. But now everything had changed. And as soon as he saw his opponent, that hunter named Jin Woo, begin to emerge from the fire, he realized that now all he had to do was run to survive. And he began to heal. By doing so, Jin Woo noticed it, and he couldn't understand. But soon it was Hunter Min Ben's healing skill, and it was the first time he sees a monster appropriating the skill of the opponents he had devoured. The ant started to fly as far away as possible to get away from this hunter as quickly as possible. But, come on! At the same moment, Jin Woo started to activate his ruler hand skill and thus swatted that ant straight to the earth. The ant began to bleed orange blood, but Jin Woo was already beside him and began to say that he would not leave at any cost. And at that moment, he activated the mutilation skill. Eventually, he was able to destroy that ant, and the notification system showed that he had killed the enemy. His level was raised, but suddenly, the head started shouting that Hunter Cha was very unwell. Jin Woo realized that he had been messing around with this ant for too long and began to think that he needed to find a healer as soon as possible. Shadow exchange wouldn't help here, and his skill hadn't rolled back yet. Moreover, he had never tried traveling with other people, and even if they flew castle, Hunter Cha wouldn't last that long. And on the side of the bared fangs, there's at least one healer left there, but that wouldn't help anytime soon, and he began to think that he would have to find another way. Jin Woo started to tell the videographer if he could turn off the camera for a minute, but he didn't understand what he needed to do. Jin Woo's hunter started to tell him with a serious face that he better hurry up and turn off the camera or he would break it. And that's when he realized and took his camera off his head, but the videographer couldn't understand why he was clinging to his camera. Jin Woo started ordering his shadows to hurry up and find the corpse of the hunter healer. Soon, one of the higher orcs began carrying the healer's body, and as he laid it on the ground, Jin Woo realized that his head had been bitten off. He didn't know if extracting the shadow would work. The head of the white tiger started to ask what he was going to do, but at the same moment, the system showed that he could extract the shadow. And with that, Jin Woo rejoiced, for this was the last chance he could use to save the huntress. As soon as he started to tell the shadow to rise, the shadow extraction failed, and he couldn't understand what was wrong. He commanded it to rise a second time, but the shadow extraction failed again, and he began to ponder that given his ability level, he could easily extract any shadow. But it seems that his soul is desperately resisting and doesn't want to become a shadow soldier. In fact, Jin Woo was unwilling to take people into the army to be his subordinates. However, the living must live, and Jin Woo ordered him to rebel for the last time. At this moment, the head of the white tiger came closer and closer and placed his hand on his shoulder, thus asking him what he was doing. Suddenly, he saw that he had a special ability, and that was what his power was: he could control the dead. The other hunters did not understand how he could summon the souls of the dead. Thus, Hunter Jin Woo found himself not just a mage, but someone capable of manipulating souls and harnessing their power. The shadow he retrieved from his spellbook began to approach the hunter, and he used its power to heal her. The head of the white tiger realized that her friend who had recently been killed had turned into a shadow and began to heal the huntress Jin Woo. She started to say that he seems to be starting to realize what kind of person he was when he was alive, and he didn't even have time to give orders and he had already started treating Huntress Cha. He was incredibly kind and compassionate, but White Tiger's head started to say that now he wasn't the man she knew. Jin Woo replied that he was. The videographer at that moment couldn't believe what he saw, for he had never heard once that it was possible to summon the dead. He understood why he had asked him to turn off the camera, for such power was best not to broadcast to the world. Some of the hunters realized that the stronger his opponent was, the faster he built up his power, and they wondered how terrifying that ability was. And the head of the white tiger at this point began to say that he knew that he would be given many more times to engage in battle, and at this point, the healer's abilities would come in handy. However, he had never liked combat, and so he began to ask Jin Woo not to force him to do something that would hurt him. Jin Woo thought about it, but at this moment, he threw back the arm of the head of the white tiger and began to tell him what he needed to do. Grabbing him by the shoulder of the one coat for the second time, yes, that was an order. And now the very thing was a sincere request. Besides, he had similar thoughts himself. Jin Woo began to cancel the summoning, and that shadow healer turned to the head of the white tiger and smiled back at him. In the blink of an eye, and now, for the moment, there was silence in this cave, and such silence had never been here before. Everyone watched in silence as the shadow soldier disappeared. A little while later, the hunters started coming out of that cave, and the helicopter that had come to join them started hovering above them. Those on the helicopter noticed that the hunters were coming towards them. Jin Woo started to tell them to go without him, as he had unfinished business here. The head of the white tiger realized that the battle wasn't over yet. Jin Woo started to say that he would go and clear the way, deal with the remaining ants. And at that moment, he summoned his shadow dragon Kaisel, and as soon as he sat on it, he said to the head of the white tiger, "See you later." And he began to fly up into the air, and his huge wings began to slash in the air those ants that came in his way. At this time, on one of the cruisers sat the hunters who were from the Japanese Association. One of the hunters kept saying that this monster is a real terror and they just haven't seen him. Therefore, they can't realize how terrifying he is. Their leader, Ruji, was killed in such a brutal way. He starts saying that they can't defeat him and this raid is doomed to fail. The hunter who was destroying that monster didn't have time to finish his sentence. At this time, another man standing above him started to tell him not to worry. That hunter thought it was a lie, but it was the official information they had just received from the Korean headquarters. And that man began to reflect that it seems that Korea also has a rather capable hunter. However, he's probably weaker than Goto-san, but suddenly the staff started saying that the ants were running away, and the cruisers started making preparations, but at this time, the battle continued on the island, and Jin Woo continued to exterminate all the ants. He began to realize that once he destroyed the ants that hadn't hatched yet, he could gain some experience. This was incredible luck, and when he called up his inventory, he saw that he could restore order with the sword he had gotten when he passed the demonic castle. He started pulling this sword out of his inventory, and as soon as he saw it, he realized that he had completely forgotten about it. He then began to look at its functionality, swung the sword, and a huge electric wave began to cut everything around him. He marveled at how powerful this sword was, and couldn't understand how he could have forgotten it existed in his inventory. Still, he decided to deal with the remaining eggs with this tool. On another continent, the director of the Hunter Management Bureau was watching a tape on television and realized that while they were watching the broadcast, morning had imperceptibly come. He started talking to the man who had barged in on him at such a late hour. A hunter who can summon hundreds of souls is actually a very talented guy. Not taking advantage of his abilities within South Korea is a big miss. The other man was also in agreement with this. In addition, he had heard about a high-profile case that happened a few months ago in the Hunter Management Bureau. This case is known as the Sun Il Huan case. This is the same prisoner that Hunter James captured when he was cleaning up the Orange Dungeon that emerged in the east of America. They didn't really know whether he was a monster or a human. However, he claimed to be a Korean hunter. Fortunately, all the information was kept in the bureau and the investigation revealed that the man was Sung Jin, father and son. Other countries don't even know who Jin Woo is, so they should take advantage of this. And the case of Hwang Dong-soo is a different story. After all, Korea is their ally. However, if they appropriate two S-ranked hunters at once, it might seem as if they decided to turn their backs on them. The other man started to say that if he could arrange it, it would be fine. However, at this time, Jin Woo's level was raised, and thus he had reached the 100th level. As soon as he approached that ant, he realized that there was a rather powerful aura coming from that guy, and ordered him to rise up. Correct the text for errors, but suddenly nothing happened and darkness started appearing everywhere and he didn't start feeling anything. Because he had used the shadow extraction skill on himself, everything suddenly went dark and he realized that he had failed. But suddenly, the shadow returned, and he appeared behind him. At the same moment, the notification system showed that he had successfully retrieved Jin Woo's shadow. Rejoicing, because he thought he had already failed, a terrifying shadow soldier stood in front of him, and the general was beside him. Jin Woo, looking at his new shadow soldier, realized that a new Iran had opened up. An ordinary elite knight no longer means the next one. Here comes the general, and it turns out he's a head above the rest of the soldiers. Not surprising, though, since his abilities are incredible. And now it was the queen's turn to rebel, but suddenly the shadow ant started talking and addressed Jin Woo with the words Lord. For the master to give him a name, and Jin Woo realized that he too had contracted the absolute loyalty syndrome like all shadow warriors. He wondered how he learned to talk, but he replied that he already knew how to do it. And then Jin Woo realized that he knew how to talk because he originally had the ability, but that wasn't the point. After all, Iron was a human, just like Hunter Min Ben and Fong, and it was all about rank, not the impossibilities he couldn't give. Jin Woo pondered, what will happen if the others increase their rank? Will I be able to talk to them too? He started to talk to the ant about killing him, and still the ant wants to obediently follow him. But the ant replied that he was not killed but resurrected by the king's power, and now his soul is overflowing with joy. Henceforth he would follow only his king forever. He bowed once more and asked the king to give him a name. For Jin Woo hesitated for a moment.